Constantinople, 1656. The most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire, after the Sultan himself, signs an order that reads like a fever dream. Grand Vizier Mehmed Pasha declares that a certain kind of public gathering place must close, every last one of them, at once. First offense earns a public beating. Second offense, his soldiers sew the offender into a leather sack and drop him into the Bosphorus to drown. Not for treason, not for murder, not for plotting against the throne, for serving a hot brown drink, coffee, an empire with armies stretching from Vienna to Baghdad, and its second most powerful man lay awake at night frightened of a beverage. He knew exactly what happened in the rooms where people drank it. He was not being paranoid. By the end of this, you will understand why every ruler who tried to kill coffee ended up looking like a coward who lost. But the story started long before any vizier reached for a leather sack in a place nobody in Constantinople could have found on a map. Picture a farmer in the Ethiopian highlands around the year 850. Ask him what a coffee bean is, and the answer comes back as a blank stare. There was no word for it. No drink, no cup, nothing. There was only a wild shrub with red berries growing on the forested slopes of Kaffa, a region in the southwest of modern Ethiopia. Some trace the word coffee back to that region's name, Kaffa, but the stronger case points to an Arabic word that arrived centuries later. And we will get to it. Most people have heard the legend. A goat herder named Kaldi watches his goats prance and refuse to sleep after eating red berries off a bush. He tries them himself, feels a jolt, and coffee is born. A lovely story, and almost certainly invented. That tale first appears in writing in 1671 in a book by a Maronite scholar named Antoine Faustus Nyron. Hat is more than 800 years after Kaldi supposedly danced with his goats. 8 centuries of silence. And then a tidy origin myth shows up right as Europeans went hunting for a charming backstory to sell their new favorite import. Convenient timing. What really happened is harder and less cute. Coffea arabica, the plant behind roughly 60% of the coffee the world drinks today, grew wild in those forests for thousands of years before anyone brewed it. The Oromo people did not make a drink at all. They ground the beans, mixed the paste with animal fat, and rolled it into dense little balls. A warrior could carry one on a long march and chew it for a burst of energy. Portable fuel, the world's first energy bar, made from a plant nobody had yet thought to boil. So the first humans to reach for coffee did not sip it in a cafe at dawn. They swallowed it before a fight. The leap from an energy ball to an actual drink happened across the Red Sea, in Yemen, sometime in the 1400s. It happened because of prayer, not pleasure. Sufi mystics in the port city of Mocha needed to stay awake through long night rituals, chanting and swaying until sunrise. Someone worked out that the beans arriving from Ethiopia could be roasted, ground, and steeped in hot water. The result was a bitter, dark liquid that kept the eyelids from falling shut. They named it kahwa, the Arabic word that most likely became coffee. It originally meant wine, a drink forbidden under Islam. Coffee inherited the name because it did something loosely similar. It altered how a person felt, but it sharpened the mind instead of dulling it. And the mystics guarded their legal high like a state secret. Yemen sat on a gold mine and knew it. For roughly 200 years, Mocha ran a near total monopoly on the global coffee supply. Merchants sailed in from India, Egypt, Persia, and eventually Europe, and they left with sacks of beans. But the Yemenis pulled a clever trick to protect that fortune. Before a single bean left the port, it was boiled or roasted, killed at the seed so it could never sprout on foreign soil. Anyone could buy the coffee. Nobody could buy the plant. That strange scheme held for 2 centuries. Then a pilgrim named Baba Budan supposedly smuggled 7 fertile seeds out of Mecca, strapped to his belly around 1670, and planted them in the hills of Chikmagalur in southern India. 7 seeds broke a 200-year monopoly. Hold on to that, because the Dutch were watching and they were next. Nervous coffee reached Mecca, then Cairo, then Damascus, and everywhere it arrived, the same thing appeared alongside it. A room. Not a mosque, not a palace, but a public room where any man with a small coin could sit, order a cup, and stay for hours. They called them kahve khane, coffee houses. The world had never seen anything quite like them. Think about what came before. Where did an ordinary person go just to talk? The mosque, where voices stayed low. The market, where you did your business and left. Home, where the only company was family. Suddenly there existed a place built entirely around sitting, drinking, and running your mouth. And people took to it instantly. They played chess and backgammon. They listened to musicians and poets. They read books aloud to the illiterate. And they argued about the government. That last habit is what ruined everything. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg, walked past a coffee house at night. He saw a knot of people gathered, alert, murmuring, and convinced himself they were mocking him. He assembled a panel of scholars, had them declare coffee an intoxicant on par with wine, and banned it outright, and beans burned in the streets. It became the first recorded coffee ban in history. It lasted about as long as it took the Sultan in Cairo to hear about it and overrule him, because the Sultan happened to enjoy his coffee. Khair Beg was executed within the year. Coffee, it turned out, had friends in higher places. The pattern was set, and it would repeat across 3 continents for the next 200 years, as one ruler after another discovered the same uncomfortable fact. They kept banning the drink. What actually frightened them was the room. Which brings us back to that vizier in Constantinople. When the Ottomans embraced coffee in the mid-1500s, coffee houses spread through the capital like a rumor. By the 1600s, the city held hundreds of them, packed with precisely the crowd a nervous throne feared most. Off-duty soldiers, palace clerks, minor officials, educated men who knew things and had loud opinions about them. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640, hated all of it. He banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol in one sweep, and he did not stop at posting notices on walls. According to the chronicles of the age, he disguised himself as a commoner and roamed the streets of his own capital after dark. When he caught someone breaking the ban, he executed them on the spot with a sword he carried for the purpose. Some accounts put the death toll in the thousands over his reign. Picture a sitting emperor patrolling his own city at night to personally kill people over a cup of coffee. That is fear you can count in bodies. His successors kept the leather sack punishment on the books for decades. Why go this far over a drink? Because a coffee house worked as an information network long before anyone invented the phrase. News landed there first. Grievances got aired there loudly. If a conspiracy against the crown was going to take shape anywhere, it would take shape in a room full of caffeinated men who all quietly agreed the government had failed them. The sultans were not wrong about the danger. They were simply early. And wherever the coffee houses had already taken root, every ban failed anyway. Authorities could drown the drinkers on Monday and find fresh ones on Tuesday. Coffee had become the one thing an empire could no longer uninvent. Coffee slipped into Europe through Venice around 1615, carried by the same merchants who traded with the Ottomans. At first, the Catholic clergy wanted it banned too. denouncing it as the bitter invention of Satan. The story goes that Pope Clement VIII decided to taste the devil's drink before condemning it. He found he loved it and joked that they ought to baptize it and cheat Satan out of a victory. Whether or not that exchange happened, the church stood down and the drink kept marching north. Then came 1683 and Vienna. The Ottoman army, more than 100,000 strong under Kara Mustafa, laid siege to the city for 2 months. A combined Christian force shattered them and sent them fleeing east. In their abandoned camp, the Viennese found tents, gold, camels, and hundreds of sacks of strange green beans nobody recognized. Most assumed the sacks held camel feed and wanted them burned. A man named Franz Georg Kolschitsky had spent time among the Ottomans and knew exactly what the beans were. He claimed them, and legend credits him with opening one of Vienna's first coffee houses. The tale is probably embroidered, since cafes already existed in the city, but the beans left behind by a defeated empire really did help seed Central Europe's coffee habit. A drink the Ottomans loved conquered the very continent their army had just failed to. England is where coffee got genuinely dangerous to those in power. The first English coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650. Another followed in London in 1652. By the year 1700, the capital held more than 2,000 of them. A single cup cost 1 penny, and for that penny, a customer got the coffee plus something worth far more, full access to the conversation in the room. People started calling them penny universities. A laborer could sit down beside a scholar, a merchant, a scientist, or a sailor just off a ship and absorb more in one afternoon than in a year of solitude. Each house drew its own tribe. Members of the Royal Society argued natural philosophy at once. Poets and playwrights sharpened their insults at another. Traders crowded into a house near the docks run by a man named Edward Lloyd, who by 1686 was serving merchants and ship captains, swapping news about which vessels had sailed and which had gone down. That endless gossip about shipping risk grew directly into the business of insuring the ships. Lloyd's Coffee House became Lloyd's of London, today one of the largest insurance markets on the planet, still trading under that name. The London Stock Exchange traces a nearly identical route back to a coffee house called Jonathan's around 1698. Stockbrokers thrown out of the Royal Exchange for being too rowdy simply set up shop there with their coffee. So the next time somebody calls high finance a sober and dignified world, remember that two of its greatest institutions were born in rooms full of over-caffeinated men shouting deals across the tables. By 1675, King Charles II of England had heard enough. His informants kept reporting that his subjects gathered in coffee houses to complain about his rule, spread seditious rumors, and openly question the crown. So on December 29th, 1675, he issued a royal proclamation to shut down every coffee house in the kingdom. He framed it as a matter of public morality. Nobody was fooled about the real target being the talking. The backlash arrived instantly and furiously. Coffee houses had woven themselves into the daily machinery of trade, news, and politics, and London erupted at once. Within 11 days, before the ban had even taken legal effect, Charles caved completely and quietly, withdrew the whole thing on January 8th. 11 days. A king backed by an army, and a navy could not hold a ban against a drink for 2 full weeks. One of the most powerful monarchs in Europe blinked first, and everyone on the continent noticed. A year earlier, in 1674, A group had even published the Women's Petition Against Coffee. It complained that the drink made their husbands useless and kept them out of the house at all hours. That alone shows how thoroughly the habit had taken over English life. The lesson rang out clearly. You cannot close the room. The people inside have already decided they would rather keep their coffee and their conversation than obey. And there are always more of them than there are soldiers. That lesson did not stay politely in England. It sailed. By the 1700s, coffee had burrowed into the daily lives of Europe's thinkers, artists, and troublemakers. Some of them took the habit to unhealthy extremes. The philosopher Voltaire reportedly drank as many as 40 cups of coffee mixed with chocolate a day and lived to 83 while doing it. Johann Sebastian Bach loved the drink so much that in 1735 he wrote a comic piece now called the Coffee Cantata. It follows a young woman refusing to give up coffee even when her father threatens to block her marriage over it. Ludwig van Beethoven counted out exactly 60 beans for every cup he brewed, trusting no one else to measure. These were not idle indulgences. The Enlightenment, that whole explosion of new political and scientific thinking across the 1700s, ran largely on caffeine and unfolded inside cafes. Sober, alert, argumentative men sat in those rooms and picked apart kings, churches, and old certainties. Europe had spent centuries lightly drunk on beer and wine from breakfast onward because the water was unsafe. Coffee arrived and swapped a mild all-day buzz for a sharp all-day focus. A continent that had been pleasantly fuzzy started thinking clearly and dangerously instead. It did not take long for that clarity to turn into something a king could not survive. Paris, 1789. The city runs on coffee, holding hundreds of cafes. The most famous of them, like the Café de Foix in the arcades of the Palais Royal, buzz with argument from morning until deep into the night. The Palais Royal held one strange advantage. It belonged to a duke, so royal police could not freely enter, which turned the whole complex into a free speech zone by accident. On July 12th, a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table outside the Café de Foix. He stuttered so badly he had nearly given up on public speaking, but he had just heard the king dismiss the popular finance minister. He drew a pistol, shouted that royal troops were coming to massacre the people, and called the crowd to arms. To arms! The mob roared back. He snatched a green leaf from a tree to wear as a rebel cockade, and thousands copied him within minutes. 2 days later, that same crowd stormed the Bastille. The French Revolution had its starting gun fired outside a coffee house by a man who could barely finish a sentence when he was calm. No serious historian claims coffee caused the revolution, and reducing it to that would be dishonest. Bread prices, crushing national debt, and an out-of-touch monarchy all lit the real fuse. But the cafes were where that fuse got laid. They were where strangers hardened into a movement, and where one pamphlet read aloud reached 100 men who each carried it home to 100 more. Across the Atlantic, the American colonists had already made coffee a political weapon. After they dumped British tea into Boston Harbor in 1773, drinking tea began to look like a public confession of loyalty to the crown. So coffee became the patriot's cup instead. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that he had switched to coffee and must break himself of tea for good. In 1777, a Boston crowd of angry women seized a hoarding merchant, tipped him into a cart, and took his coffee by force when he tried to price gouge them. A drink had turned into a flag. Choosing your morning cup now meant choosing a side in a war. Here is the strange bit about how coffee reached the Americas at all. Around 1714, the city of Amsterdam gave King Louis XIV of France a single coffee plant as a gift. The king kept it in a royal greenhouse in Paris like a treasure. In 1723, a French naval officer, Gabriel de Clieu, obtained a seedling from that plant, or stole it, and carried it by ship toward Martinique. The crossing was a nightmare of pirates, storms, and a dead calm that left the ship low on water. De Clieu later claimed he shared his own tiny water ration with the seedling to keep it alive through the drought. That one plant survived and took root in Martinique. Within decades, its descendants numbered in the tens of millions across the Americas. Brazil got its own start in 1727. An officer named Francisco de Melo Paleta was sent to French Guiana to settle a border dispute. The story goes that he charmed the governor's wife into hiding fertile coffee seeds inside a bouquet she handed him as a farewell gift. From that smuggled bouquet grew the country that would one day produce roughly a third of all the coffee on Earth. Much of the coffee in a cup this morning descends from one guarded greenhouse plant and one bouquet of hidden seeds spread by theft, charm, and one officer willing to go thirsty for a seedling. But that clean little story of stolen seedlings and hidden bouquets leaves out the part the cozy cafe branding never mentions. Coffee did not spread on charm alone. Long before de Clieu, around 1616, a Dutch merchant named Peter van den Broek had smuggled live plants out of Yemen, and by 1699, the Dutch had coffee thriving across their colony on Java, in what is now Indonesia. That is where the slang in a coffee order comes from, by the way. A cup of Java, a cup of mocha, both just the names of ports and islands wrapped around a much darker supply chain. Coffee is brutal to farm. Every cherry has to be picked by hand. The fruit rots within days, and the whole crop demands enormous amounts of cheap labor. Europe's empires supplied that labor the way they supplied everything in that era, with people they never intended to pay. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the island we now call Haiti, enslaved Africans grew coffee that supplied more than half the entire world's beans by the 1780s. The conditions killed people so fast that the enslaved population had to be constantly replenished with fresh captives shipped in to replace the dead. That is the true fuel behind Europe's polished cafe culture. Enslaved hands worked to death, so a gentleman in Paris could sip something warm and feel worldly. In 1791, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rose up. The Haitian Revolution burned those coffee plantations to ash while founding the first free black republic in the world. The planet's biggest coffee supplier vanished almost overnight, and the trade simply relocated. Brazil picked up the slack. It imported close to 5 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country in the Americas, and forced vast numbers onto coffee estates. By the 1840s, Brazil grew the majority of the world's coffee on the backs of the enslaved. It did not abolish slavery until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. When people say coffee helped build the modern world, this is the half of the sentence that usually gets swallowed.